Welcome to the Unlist. This is part 2 of my Avon video. I had to break it into 2 parts because a house with over 140 plus years of history and 4 times the fragrances of like the next biggest house out there, you can't contain that in one video. I don't think I could contain Guerlain in one video, let alone Avon. And Avon has been around almost as long as Guerlain has, and yet has like 4 times the amount of fragrances they have. Think about that for a second. That's ridiculous. Last I left off, I actually touched upon how they have so many fragrances and how there's like literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and you could fill an entire room with them. I've got over 100 different Avon fragrances myself, and I've barely scratched the surface, as I said in the first part of the video. Well, I'm going to address why that is, and I'm also going to talk about some of their modern comings and goings. The first video dealt with more of their origins and how they were kind of the first real MLM or multi-level marketing company, which means the success of Avon is why we had stuff like Fuller Brush Company and Kirby Vacuums and Mary Kay and all that other stuff, Amway, Tupperware. So yay, thanks, right? All that annoying door-to-door stuff. You can trace it all back to the success of Avon, which was originally known as the California Perfume Company. Watch the first video if you're discovering this one and you want all that information. This is going to deal more with the style of the perfumes themselves, how they smell, like I said, more modern comings and goings of the brand, where they've been heading these days. And also I'm going to talk about some criticisms of the house, some strengths and weaknesses. I want to be fair. Even though this is one of my most collected brands and I have a lot of personal history with the brand, it's my starting point actually in fragrance, I still want to be fair. I'm not going to try and praise be and proselytize this house to you. You're going to know all the stuff good and bad about Avon before this video comes to an end. So let's get started. First of all, as I mentioned in the first video, Avon really became the bread and butter of the middle income homemaker, the housewife. And this was by design, because the whole idea of social selling, getting a bunch of homemakers together, next door neighbors, relatives, to sit around, discuss the perfumes, sell them to each other. So the brand only has to create the product and create the materials, and the stuff literally sells itself. And that's one of the reasons why Avon fragrances are so inexpensive, despite being comparatively high quality, or at least at a quality parity similar to a designer or something like that. I talked about how they get away with that because they can have very low margins, since they don't have all of the overhead traditional perfume brands have. No retail space, no third-party distributors, none of that. Since their products are basically being busked around door to door by a bunch of unpaid people who only make money on what they sell, and that's it. You know, they're not getting paid by the hour, they're not getting a salary here. So anyhow, the middle American homemaker wasn't typically super knowledgeable about fashion outside of what they saw in magazines, which Avon had ads in magazines, as I mentioned in the first video. So you couldn't really sell them on prestige and exclusivity. You couldn't sell them on that hubris that a lot of designers and niche brands do of, oh, this is Louis XIV's perfume brand, or King Charles or the various Habsburgs wore this fragrance. The average Susie homemaker in the 50s and 60s that lived in a cul-de-sac somewhere in Indiana, okay, and her husband worked at a steel mill or something, and they had 2 kids that went to local public schools, and they like to watch Ed Sullivan and eat TV dinners. They didn't give a crap about that. So you couldn't sell them on that. Oh, this is water imported from India. You couldn't sell them on that. That wouldn't work. So they had to go a different way. Novelty. They had to go with one of the most basic driving instincts that gets a person to want something. Novelty. Now it's funny because these days a lot of designers actually exploit that same desire for novelty, which is why we have so many forgettable flankers and fragrances that come out and get discontinued like a year later. But back in the day, when designers were not really not really wanting to do that. They wanted a long-term fragrance that would sit on the market for decades if possible. They wanted to create something that was iconic, that stood out, and could become a timeless classic, right? That was the mentality back then, you know. The Chanel No. 5, for example, 50 years on the market, almost unchallenged. So that wasn't in the DNA of designers back then like it is now. But Avon, day one, that was Avon's thing, novelty. These people don't have the scruples to care about exclusivity and prestige and nobility of materials and all that stuff. You couldn't sell them on that stuff. They didn't know, didn't care. They'd be like, okay, that's great. So what does that mean to me? Does the stuff smell good? Does it come in a fun bottle, right? That's it. Is there a skin cream I can buy with this? Because Avon sells cosmetics too, right? So the first thing anybody who bought Avon was wondering is, oh, this smells good. Do you have a shampoo? Do you have a deodorant? Do you have this? Do you have that? Because I don't just want the smell. I want these other things too, right? And of course, Avon sold a lot of their fragrances like that, with full skincare treatments, full suites of grooming products if it's a men's thing, you know. So usually the answer to that question was yes. Yes, I can hook you up with a perfume. We have the matching skin cream. We have the matching aftershave. We have the matching talcum powder. We have the matching bath oil, bar soap, whatever, okay? So, but novelty. And that is why they have like over 800 fragrances, you know, since the 1880s. Cranking them out sometimes once a month. You know, a new fragrance release. And it's also because they sold at such large volumes, they didn't need to have anything with market longevity either. So they could order a single batch of oil from an oil house. Once we move on to remember, they did it all in-house for like a century. So from like 1880 to like 1980 something, Avon had their own perfumers, their own labs. But after that, they were doing the same thing that everyone else was doing, using Varanis, using IFF, so on and so forth. But they could literally just get a single oil batch, you know, have a perfumer for whoever create the fragrance for them, have one single bottling run, sell that bottling run completely out, and then not care. Move on to the next fragrance. There's no loss there. And there's no loss there because they don't have the extreme costs on distribution and advertisement, hiring actors and fashion models and stuff like that. Again, their costs are very minimal. So they don't lose money by releasing a fragrance only one time and then never making it again. They don't lose money on that. They can do that and still profit, right? So it's novelty. They need to keep getting you buying the next thing. So in order to do that, every new catalog has new stuff in it. Every new catalog has new fragrances, new cosmetics. Some of the ones that sell really well, like if they sell completely out in like the first month or two, they'll go, okay, yeah, we should keep that one around. So there are some classic evergreen Avon fragrances that have been on the books forever. You know, what's funny is their most long-lived fragrances are all men's stuff somehow. Don't ask me how. A brand that focuses so intently on women, but their longest-lived fragrances are all on the men's side. Like Wild Country has never ceased production since 1967, right? That's one notable example. It's been on the books since 67, and it's still being sold. People are still buying it. But anyhow, now you know why there are so many fragrances, because novelty. And of course, that also leads into why all the bottles are so tacky, because again, it's novelty. You can't sell somebody on concepts of elegance and refinement, because we're talking, you know, some woman in an apron making a grilled cheese for a screaming child. She does not care about elegance and refinement. She just wants to smell good. She's got to keep these kids fed, send them off to school. She barely has enough time to watch her daytime TV, you know, and maybe chat with the girlfriend on the phone for a little bit before the husband comes in and demands dinner. That was the life of the 60s and the 70s homemakers, okay? So make it a fun, cool bottle, something that looks, you know, looks interesting, visually appealing. And then, of course, there's that other factor of a lot of these fragrances were not sold via consultation. They were not sold via you letting the Avon lady into your house and then she can sit there and let you smell these. A lot of times, people would see the magazine ads, they would see the TV commercials and want to buy the fragrance without even smelling it. So the bottle had to look cool. You know, hey, that looks cool, I'm going to buy that. And it's such a low price, right? It's not enough money to worry about. So this is only 10 bucks and the bottle is shaped like a peacock feather. Okay, I'll buy it, 10 bucks. What's the worst that could happen, right? So again, the novelty fed into the tackiness, fed into the constant release cycle, you know, that's the world of Avon, all right? And you might be thinking, well, if they're pumping out so many fragrances, a lot of them have to smell alike. Yes and no. I mean, yeah, it would be a fair assessment that a lot of Avon fragrances run in tropes, but it's no different than designer fragrances, no different than drugstore fragrances. So yeah, you've got about a half dozen different Avons from the 50s and 60s that all try to vibe with Chanel No. 5 or Joy or Arpege or one of those. Then you have another half dozen or so that try to vibe with Mitsoko or one of those classic Guerlains. Another half dozen or so that go in a more of an amber direction like a Dana Taboo or something like that. They don't smell the same. They're not the same fragrance in a different bottle with a different name. They are different, unique creations, but they definitely follow themes, you know. There were quite a number of fougères, for example, that Avon put out in the 60s and 70s that follow a very similar trajectory as a Canois, as a Clubman Pinot. So Wild Country being one of those, Thai Winds being another, okay, for 72. So yeah, they do have some well-worn grooves. But again, these fragrances don't smell identical. They're not clones of anything, and they're certainly not clones of each other. So they are functionally unique. They may be similar in some ways, but they are functionally unique. And also Avon liked to do iterative creation, where they would take an idea, see how well it did, make some changes to it, and make a similar fragrance with a few key twists on it. So you can kind of play the Ancestry.com game where you see a fragrance and then a couple years later, a similar fragrance that's a little bit greener, a similar one a few years later that's a little bit spicier. A few years later, the same idea reappears and now they decided to go in more of a soapy direction with it, a cleaner direction. And they all smell like they could be flankers to each other, right? They could be part of the same line, but they all have unique names and unique bottles. So in some cases, they are spiritual flankers, but not true flankers, okay? Again, when you have 800 fragrances, this sort of thing happens. You have to just know what to expect with the brand. Now, the smell of Avon fragrances. This is the thing. For most of Avon's tenure, from the 1880s until about the 1980s, when all their stuff was being done in-house, another way they would save cost is keeping their formulas very simple. So for example, one of their earliest fragrances called Trailing Arbutus from the 1910s, it only has 6 materials in it. The whole formula, which is so old now that if it had I mean, you can't patent a formula anyway, but it's so old now that it's leaked onto the internet. It's in some archive somewhere. 6 materials, that's it. Makes up Trailing Arbutus. And it's a very gorgeous fragrance. It's a very rosewood-focused fragrance, okay? You have to like rosewood to like the scent. But it's a very gorgeous fragrance, but it's simple. It's nothing doing. It's just high-quality materials, but less of them, okay? That is another way that they saved on R&D costs. They didn't have these grandiose Guerlain-style 50 materials, super long fragrance formula list like this. They didn't do that, okay? Just funny because a lot of modern fragrances are also relatively simple compared to 20, 30 years ago. Again, things that people sort of complain about nowadays, Avon was always doing from day one. So always focusing on novelty, and for the longest time, always keeping their formulas simple, not skimping on material quality, not skimping on the ingredients, just not having really long form overwrought fragrance ideas that take months and months and months to develop, right? So something a perfumer can tinker with and pop out maybe a couple of weeks tops. So there's some beauty to that because they get away with some really cool stuff with only a small amount of materials. And even into the 60s and 70s where they were making some really good green chypres and really nice fougères, still relatively simple. You will notice the oak moss in these compositions. You will notice when they use tonka. Okay, you will notice when they use animalic musks. There are a lot of very civet heavy fragrances on the women's side for Avon in those days because, again, not a whole lot of materials per fragrance. So the ingredients themselves can shine more. And a lot of people like that note separation. It's funny, niche brands who sell you perfumes in the hundreds of dollars like to go on about the note separation, how each material can stand on its own merits and you can smell it. Well, you can do that with an Avon fragrance from the 1960s or 70s, just the same, and pay like 10, 20 bucks on eBay for that and get that same note separation experience that you can get from that $300, $400 whatever you got from Oswald's or Lucky Scent Bar or something, right? It's craziness, right? It's craziness. So that helped them keep the costs low. And of course, I also mentioned how Avon was willing to spend 2 or 3 times the same price that a designer would spend on the oil. Once they began to outsource all their briefs to other oil houses, they were still willing to spend more money for the oil than some designer competitors because, again, they didn't have the overhead, so they didn't care. All right, they didn't have to pay Leonardo DiCaprio or someone else to advertise their fragrances for them. They didn't have all these billion-dollar things going on. It's Avon. It's all sold by homemakers. Now, the thing is, for the average person who is not kind of up their own keister, Avon smells perfectly fine. I mean, Avon fragrances, you know, the biggest criticisms I can find for the brand, okay, is that Avon has a bit of an uncanny valley effect on people who are in the fragrance community, who actually give them a chance and go start sniffing them. Because you start sniffing around a bunch of Avon fragrances and you're not used to the brand. Like, you're not like me. It's not like, you know, hard-coded in your DNA. You dive in head first. You will find a lot of Avon fragrances have an uncanny valley effect on you because they smell like something you've smelled before. But they are just different enough to not fully smell like that thing. So you try and call them a clone. You try and compare them to something. But then you're like, no, because this fragrance has an orris note where the thing I'm trying to compare it to doesn't contain orris. Or no, this has a leather profile and the thing I'm trying to compare it to doesn't have a leather profile. Or no, this has an oddly floral heart to it and the thing I'm trying to compare it to doesn't have a floral heart. See, that's the problem you get. And it leads you down this sort of rabbit hole where you end up going, well, it's kind of like a cross between this and maybe a little bit of this. And then you fail to realize that that's a unique fragrance. It's not actually a blend of anything. I had that problem myself early on when I was reviewing a bunch of these. I'm like, well, this kind of smells like Cool Water and Eternity mixed together. And yes, you could say that. It's a bit of a disservice though, but yes, you could say that. But in reality, it's not like either of them really. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. And it's a good thing because it means Avon is kind of outside the box. They're willing to cross the streams like they tell you not to do in Ghostbusters. But it's a bad thing because if you're someone with an extensive knowledge of fragrances, it kind of sends you through a mental gymnastics championship, you know, a jungle gym, right? So if you're looking for something that's so blazingly, blaringly, undeniably unique and avant-garde, you're not going to find it with Avon because that's not how they make money. They don't make money impressing people or scaring people. They make money by delivering fragrances that are novel but also comfy. Remember, middle America, average Joe, average Jane was a person buying these fragrances, not somebody with their nose up in the air like this. So they can't make a fragrance for that person, all right? They can't make a fragrance like Zoologist. They can't make a fragrance like half of the L'Artisan profile. They can't do half of that stuff. Their market wouldn't buy something like that. Their market wouldn't buy Dzing, okay? Their market wouldn't buy Rien. Their market wouldn't mess with that. So they can't go that route. So another fair criticism I can make about a fragrance brand such as Avon is because they have such a large catalog of fragrances, and their fragrances both live and die so quickly on the market that it's one of those things where if you blink, you miss it. And then, of course, the other thing about Avon, too, a criticism about the brand, is that since it's all mail order and it's all door-to-door, they would customize both the names, the packaging, and the selection for the market once they became a global brand like they are today. So you might have fragrances released in Mexico that are the same fragrance under a different name with a different bottle, but it's the same fragrance as a fragrance from the United States or from the UK. So there is a fragrance called His Story, came out in 2003, and it was released in the UK as Retrospect. There is a fragrance called RPM that was released in the US, but it was released in Mexico as KMH because I guess they use kilometers down there. And then it was also released as Full Speed in Europe. So 3 different names, same fragrance. So yeah, that can be a bit daunting and a bit confusing for people. And if you live in countries that never really had Avon, then all of this is a waste of time for you anyway. Now, on to some of my favorites. Last but not least, I figure like I've armed you with enough knowledge now, I can wind this down. So the thing is, with so many different fragrances and such a long history on the market, and since the brand is basically not valued by most people, they're all cheap and easy to find, assuming you live in an area that had a lot of Avon sold on the market. So, you know, you live in the United States, eBay is a playground for you when it comes to Avon. Okay, you live in Canada, Mexico, same thing. UK had a pretty large Avon market as well. I think they still do, same thing. Pretty good selection of it on eBay. So it's a really good way to explore vintage fragrances without paying an arm and a leg, because you can get a lot of good vintage Avons for cheap. My favorites, Black Suede is my #1. It's actually my #1 favorite fragrance of all time. It still is. I've worn Black Suede more than anything else in my life, and I probably will continue to do so until the light takes me. So that's one. One of my favorite Avon women's fragrances is called Elusive. Elusive is almost like a feminine market precursor to Kouros. Imagine if Kouros was made for women and made 20 years earlier than when it actually was. Yeah, that sounds like a fun time, doesn't it? Yeah, imagine that. Imagine a women's Kouros made in the 60s. That's Elusive by Avon. You should go check it out. Other ones include Mesmerized for men. If you like stuff like Tiffany for men and Chanel Pour Monsieur, Eau de Toilette Concentré, Guerlain Heritage, stuff like that, you'll like Mesmerized for men by Avon, really nice. Also, Charisma, another one, soapy, rosy, civety kind of floral. They also do some really good green sheeps for women too. Emprise gets honorable mention. Unspoken gets honorable mention. Tasha gets honorable mention. Okay. They have some good Orientals too. Akura is nice. Unforgettable is nice. Persian Wood is nice. If you want Avon's sort of similar take to a Joy or #5, I would go after Topaz is one to look for. And of course, more modern ones into the 80s and 90s. They did some stuff for other designers too. Avon has fragrances that they released for Ungaro, for Louis Farrow, some other brands. They're worth checking out. They're kind of cool. But yeah, I will do a separate video on my favorite Avon fragrances. I'll do a proper unlist for that. It won't be a part 3. It'll be a different video. But this has been my 2-parter for Avon. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.